They had been told the Americans were monsters, giants who crushed cities beneath their boots, shadows that towered over the world with weapons forged from steel and arrogance. And yet, when the Japanese prisoners stepped through the gates of the American camp, it was not the sound of rifles that froze their breath, but the sight of the men themselves, tall, broad-shouldered, impossibly towering over the weary, shrunken bodies of those who had survived starvation, firebombing, and surrender. The guards seemed almost inhuman. For the first time, the propaganda felt less like invention and more like truth made flesh. But what came after, the smiles, the gentle voices, the unexpected kindness, would shatter everything they thought they knew. Before we step deeper into this story, I'll ask something small of you. If this journey moves you, if you feel the weight of history in these voices, take a moment to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe. It helps us keep uncovering forgotten fragments of the past, stories too fragile to be left to silence. The war had already hollowed them out long before the surrender. Japanese POW women, gaunt from hunger and bruised by endless nights of firebomb raids, stumbled forward with a quiet obedience that did not come from submission, but from exhaustion. Their uniforms hung loosely on frames that had once carried pride and discipline. Now, every step felt like the dragging of memory itself, a march away from the ruins of an empire that had promised eternity but collapsed in a single breath. The road beneath their worn shoes seemed to stretch without end, but it was the sight awaiting them at the camp gates that turned their fear into something stranger. The guards stood waiting, American soldiers, young but immense, their shadows stretching long across the gravel. The Japanese POW women froze as though they had stepped into a story made flesh. For years they had been told of the enemy's unnatural height, the grotesque exaggerations that propaganda painted with heavy strokes. Yet now, here they were, towering figures with rifles at their sides, the sunlight carving their outlines into something both human and mythic. The women, who barely reached their shoulders, felt the earth tilt beneath this new reality. Even silence seemed to bend around the height of the guards, as if the air itself acknowledged the imbalance. It was not cruelty that met them, at least not immediately. The Americans barked orders, yes, but their voices carried a steady firmness rather than rage. Some of the women trembled, waiting for blows that never came, preparing for humiliation that did not arrive. Instead, the guards gestured them forward, their massive hands slicing through the air with authority that felt as heavy as the rifles they carried. For the Japanese POW women, it was a moment of dissonance, fear and awe braided into one. They had been taught to despise, but in that first sighting, despising seemed impossible. The enemy was simply too overwhelming, too different to fit neatly into the hatred they had rehearsed. The march into captivity became a procession of contrasts. Behind them lay Japan in ruins, streets turned to ash, mothers burying children in shallow graves, rice rations measured by grains. Ahead of them loomed the American camp, neat fences of barbed wire strung with precision, towers standing like watchful giants, and guards whose very presence cast the women deeper into their own smallness. For the first time in years, the Japanese POW women felt the full scale of difference, not merely of armies, but of bodies, of worlds, of destinies. One woman, named Yuki, whispered a prayer under her breath as she walked. Her hands trembled not from fear of death, but from the unshakable thought that perhaps the world outside Japan was far larger than she had ever been told. The propaganda posters had mocked American men as clumsy brutes, grotesque in their size, a caricature to be ridiculed. Yet looking up now at men whose shoulders seemed broad enough to block the sun, she felt no ridicule. She felt only the quiet collapse of certainty. Her fellow prisoners noticed her silence but did not ask. They too were looking upward, their eyes drawn again and again to the height of the guards, as if unable to stop measuring themselves against this new scale of reality. The gates closed behind them with a clang that echoed into their bones. Inside, the barracks stood in rows, functional, plain, and mercilessly clean compared to the rubble of their own homeland. The smell of wood and dust mixed with something sharper, soap, unfamiliar and almost offensive in its abundance. As the Japanese POW women were led deeper into the camp, their fear remained. But it was no longer the fear of brutality. It was something more complicated, something that gnawed quietly beneath the surface. For if the Americans were truly monsters, if their kindness was only disguise, then the women could at least cling to hatred. But what if the propaganda had been wrong? What if the towering figures who walked above them were not demons, but simply men? The day ended with a silence that none of them could name. Sitting on rough wooden bunks, the women exchanged glances that carried both questions and answers. They were captives, yes. They were defeated, undeniably. Yet what haunted them most was not the loss of freedom, but the realization that their enemy was not what they had believed. And as night fell, the shadows of the tall American guards stretched long across the camp, a reminder that tomorrow would bring not clarity, but more of this disorienting truth. The first full day inside the camp began not with cruelty, but with the clang of metal against metal as the morning bell rang out across the yard. The Japanese POW women stirred from thin sleep, blinking against the grey light seeping through wooden slats. They had braced themselves for shouting, for the stomp of boots, for the brutality they had been warned would define captivity. Instead, the guards called them to order with a discipline that felt firm but distant, as though they were not tormentors but overseers of a rhythm already established. The women rose slowly, shoulders hunched, their breaths pale in the chill of dawn. The camp itself was surrounded by wire that glittered like frost. Each strand caught the morning light until the fence seemed less a barrier than a shimmering wall of glass. Beyond it stretched fields that were neither ruins nor rubble, but wide and steady, as though the war had passed them by. For the women, the sight was unbearable, to be trapped in a place where the earth still carried calm, where the soil still seemed to breathe, was to be confronted with what they had lost. The wire reminded them not only of their captivity, but also of the silence their homeland could no longer give them. Within those fences, life began to settle into routines that mocked their expectations. Breakfast arrived, carried in steaming pots to the mess hall. The women shuffled inside, waiting for the cruelty to reveal itself in rancid food or meager scraps. Instead, they were met with bowls of porridge, bread still warm at its edges, and coffee whose bitter scent filled the air like an unfamiliar hymn. The Japanese POW women stared as though the trays had been set with jewels. For some, suspicion stiffened their posture. They whispered that this was a trick, that poison lay in the richness, that the Americans meant to fatten them only to degrade them later. But hunger pressed harder than fear, and soon hands lifted spoons, tentative, trembling, then desperate. The taste was almost unbearable in its kindness. Warmth slid down hollow stomachs, filling spaces that had long ago surrendered to emptiness. One woman, Keiko, broke into tears over her bowl, her sobs muffled as she bent low, not wanting the guards to see. Yet one of them, a tall soldier with eyes that carried no cruelty, looked briefly her way, and she froze in shame, as though gratitude itself were betrayal. To be fed by the enemy was to admit a weakness that the Reich had never prepared her to confess. Still, she ate, each bite a wound as much as a gift. The wire hummed in the wind, a constant reminder that the freedom outside belonged to others. Yet within the camp, small fragments of dignity began to return. The women were issued soap, pale and fragrant, absurd in its abundance. Their hands fumbled over it, unfamiliar with the slippery luxury. To wash, to feel filth peel away under warm water was not punishment. It was restoration, and that restoration frightened them more than any lash could have. If the enemy treated them with cruelty, they could endure it with pride. But to be treated with humanity was to be disarmed in ways far deeper than the body. At night, when the lamps glowed dimly and the guards paced beyond the wire, the Japanese POW women whispered among themselves. Some still clung to suspicion, insisting that the Americans played a cruel game, that this civility would dissolve the moment the women grew complacent. Others, though, confessed quietly to a growing unease, not because they feared mistreatment, but because they feared kindness. What did it mean to be cleaner, fuller, and safer in the custody of the enemy than they had been in their own homes? What did it mean to discover that the Reich, which had demanded loyalty unto death, had not preserved their dignity as these towering figures now did? The walls and wire of the camp held them firmly, but it was the contradictions that bound them tighter. Each day of food, each moment of rest, each glimpse of guards who smiled without mockery, chipped away at the certainty that had carried them here. The propaganda had promised monsters. The reality gave them men. And in that revelation, captivity became not only a prison of fences, but a prison of thought. As the second night fell, frost gathered once more along the wires, shining like brittle threads of glass. The Japanese POW women lay in their bunks, sleep elusive, their minds caught between the ashes of home and the uneasy abundance of captivity. They were not free, yet they were not broken. They were something in between, caught in a liminal place where the walls and the wire did not only divide them from the outside world, but from the very selves they had once been. Winter thickened over the camp, laying its hand across the fences until every strand of wire glittered like threads of ice. Breath hung heavy in the air as the Japanese women lined up for morning roll call, their thin coats buttoned tight, boots crunching against the frosted ground. Their bodies carried the memory of hunger and ruin, but already they were changing. The hollowness in their cheeks softened, the lines of fatigue eased, and the faint shine of health, so long absent, began to return. It was a transformation that frightened them more than starvation had. To become stronger under the care of the enemy was to live in contradiction. Each heartbeat a reminder that reality was not as it had been told. Inside the barracks, warmth radiated from the small stoves, filling the room with a comfort that felt almost forbidden. Women played cards fashioned from scraps of cardboard. Some sang softly in corners, while others bent over sheets of paper, writing letters with hands that trembled between hope and shame. The announcement that they could write home had left them stunned. They had imagined their families in ashes, imagined hunger gnawing at the bones of mothers and siblings. Now, with pencils scratching against paper, they were asked to bridge that distance. But what could they say? That they slept on clean bunks, that they ate bread until their stomachs were full, that soap had made their skins soft again? To write such things felt like betrayal, as though their very words confessed treason against the suffering of their homeland. Keiko sat one evening at the edge of her bunk, a sheet of paper before her. The lamplight spilled across the page, but the words would not come. She thought of her younger brother, his face thin in her memory, his body bent against the cold of their ruined home. She thought of her mother, whose hands had blistered from digging for roots in frozen earth. And then she thought of herself, in this place where guards offered cigarettes, where music sometimes drifted from a harmonica, where laughter, awkward, nervous, but real, echoed among women who had been told to expect only cruelty. The contradiction was unbearable. With tears streaking her face, Keiko wrote only 2 words: "I am alive." Then she folded the paper as though sealing away her shame. Even outside the barracks, The mirror of kindness confronted them. The guards, many barely older than the women themselves, leaned casually against posts, rifles slung but rarely raised. Their attempts at conversation came in halting phrases of broken Japanese or in gestures that meant more than words. At first, silence met them. Pride pressed the women's lips shut, their eyes fixed on the ground. But silence cracked easily under the weight of humanity. One day, a guard placed a cigarette between his fingers and held it out. For a long moment, no one moved. Then one of the women, shaking, reached forward and accepted it. The exchange was small, barely a flicker of warmth, yet it burned more deeply than the winter stove. Another evening, the sound of a harmonica drifted across the yard, clumsy notes fumbling into the stillness. The Japanese prisoner women turned their heads, unable to resist. Some smiled despite themselves, the first unguarded smiles in months. The music carried no orders, no threats, only a reminder that their captors were human, not shadows out of propaganda. And in that moment, the fence between enemy and enemy grew thinner than the frost upon the wire. But kindness, as gentle as it appeared, cut sharper than cruelty. To be shown dignity by those they were told to hate was to feel the ground of certainty shift beneath their feet. Some resisted, clinging harder to suspicion. They whispered that these gestures were false, masks for a darker intent. Yet even as they spoke, they could not deny the bread in their hands, the soap in their palms, the laughter that slipped past their defenses. The Japanese women had entered the camp expecting degradation. Instead, they found themselves reflected in a mirror that showed not victims of cruelty, but survivors of compassion. It was a reflection they could not easily accept, for it demanded that they question everything, the Reich that had shaped their loyalty, the propaganda that had steeled their resolve, the very meaning of dignity itself. Night after night, as frost tightened its grip on the wire, the women lay awake in their bunks, turning over these contradictions in silence. Some wept softly into their blankets, not because of punishment, but because mercy had revealed wounds no lash ever could. Others clutched their letters, unsent or unfinished, as though holding proof that this life was not imagined. And all of them, whether in defiance or in surrender, felt the mirror of kindness pressing against them, forcing them to see truths they had never prepared to face. The camp fell quieter in the evenings when the lamps burned low and shadows leaned long across the barrack walls. Outside, frost thickened along the fences, every strand of barbed wire catching the pale moonlight until it looked less like a barrier of steel and more like a frozen river hemming them in. Inside, the Japanese women whispered of home. The word itself felt fragile, like glass in their mouths, carrying equal parts longing and dread. For what waited there was not the memory of warmth, but of ashes. Around the stoves they gathered in small clusters, voices hushed so as not to disturb the uneasy peace of others. Some spoke of mothers whose hands had grown calloused with endless labor, of siblings who scavenged through rubble for scraps of coal or food. Others confessed the emptiness of letters never answered, whole families swallowed by the bombs that had torn their cities apart. Each memory was an echo of hunger, of nights where the air itself seemed to taste of dust and smoke. To place these stories against the backdrop of safety inside the camp was unbearable. How could they reconcile the sight of steaming bread upon their plates here with the image of their families starving half a world away? Rumors became their second language, traded as carefully as secrets. The guards never confirmed nor denied them, but the women read the shifting tone of conversations, the snatches of newspaper print, the letters some guards themselves received from home. Whispers of Japan's weakening grip reached their ears like gusts of cold wind, entire cities reduced to ash, ships sunk at sea, whispers of surrender carried from the horizon. Every rumor was like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples of fear, hope, and shame through their fragile hearts. Some clung to denial, insisting the Reich had also been declared finished a dozen times before, only to rise again. Others bowed their heads in silence, sensing that these rumors were not smoke, but fire. For Keiko, the conflict was sharper than most. She had written her brother's name 100 times across scraps of paper, praying that he had survived. The thought of him walking the ruins alone, perhaps already buried in unmarked earth, haunted her with every breath. And yet in this place she had food enough to eat, blankets that wrapped her in warmth, even moments where laughter escaped unbidden from her lips. Gratitude and guilt twisted inside her until she could no longer tell them apart. To survive here felt like a betrayal, as though every bite of bread she swallowed condemned her family to further hunger. Others confessed the same torment in their own way. One woman admitted she could no longer pray without feeling shame. How could she bow her head in thanksgiving for safety when her prayers might never reach those at home who needed it more? Another wept because she had dreamt of her husband's return, only to wake in the barracks and realize that captivity had given her a softer bed than he might ever know again. These confessions passed from mouth to ear in the dark, never spoken loudly, for each admission carried the weight of treason against memory itself. The paradox was suffocating. Within fences they were safe. Beyond them, their homeland collapsed. Every sunrise sharpened the wound. The guards who passed bread across the counter became, in the women's minds, both benefactors and enemies, symbols of a world that had undone everything they thought they knew. The Japanese women had been prepared for cruelty, for degradation, even for death. They had not been prepared for the shattering kindness that left them torn between survival and loyalty. On nights when the sky cleared, stars spilled across the heavens like shards of glass, and the women would stare upward through the wires. The constellations were the same ones their families could see, far across the Pacific. That thought offered both comfort and anguish, a reminder that no ocean, no war, no fence could truly sever them from home. As they lay in their bunks, listening to the slow breathing of their companions, many realized the truth they dared not voice. They feared returning. They feared the ruins, the hunger, the silence of empty houses. Captivity had given them back a part of their humanity, and to step outside it might mean losing it again. It was this thought, unspoken yet heavy, that bound them together. They did not know when the gates might open or whether they would walk free into ships that would carry them back across the ocean. But they knew, with a dread deeper than barbed wire, that they would never return the same. The fences outside were sharp, cold, and visible. The fences within, the ones built from shame, gratitude, fear, and memory, were far harder to escape. Spring crept into the camp quietly, as though even the earth itself feared disturbing the fragile balance of those within. The snow that had once clung to the wire fences melted into dark soil, and the first shoots of grass pushed timidly through the mud. With the thaw came rumors of endings. Some said the war had reached its last breath. Others swore surrender had already been signed. The guards carried themselves differently too, not with triumph, but with the heavy weariness of men who had seen too much. And in this shifting season, the Japanese women began to understand that their captivity would not last forever. The thought of release should have been salvation, yet for many it became a heavier weight than the captivity itself. Freedom meant return, and return meant facing the ruins of their homeland. They pictured streets they had once walked, now reduced to broken stone, families scattered or gone, a silence where once there had been festivals, music, and prayer. To go home was to face the ghost of everything they had lost. The strange abundance of the camp, food, blankets, even the small gestures of respect from their captors had dulled their hunger but sharpened their fears. They had been given life, and now they feared to lose it again. It was then that the begging began. Not loudly, not with the desperation of riot, but with the quiet breaking of dignity, knees pressed into the dirt of the yard, hands clasped in pleading, voices trembling as women implored the guards not to send them back. "Please," some whispered, their faces streaked with tears. "Here we live, out there. We do not know if life remains." For the American soldiers, hardened by years of war, there was no easy response. They had expected resentment, hatred even. Instead, they found themselves confronted with the raw human plea for safety from those who had once been the enemy. The guards spoke gently where they could, promising that release did not mean abandonment, that they would be sent back with dignity. Yet the women knew promises could not rebuild homes or resurrect the dead. Their fear was not of ships or seas, but of emptiness, of arriving in Japan and finding nothing left to bind them. In their hearts, many wished to remain among their captors, for captivity had become less terrifying than the freedom that awaited. Keiko felt this conflict most deeply of all. She had dreamed of her family every night since her capture, yet as word of release spread, she found herself dreading the day her name might be called. What if no one waited? What if she stepped off the ship to silence? She had learned to laugh here, even to write again in the journals the camp supplied, rediscovering a part of herself that war had nearly erased. The thought of losing that small flame terrified her more than chains ever had. At night, whispers filled the barracks like restless winds. Some women prayed for a miracle that would allow them to remain, others planned for survival once they returned, rehearsing in their minds how to rebuild from nothing. Yet beneath every whispered plan was the same unspoken truth. They had been changed. The war had broken them, but captivity had reshaped them, teaching them that the enemy could show mercy, that life could take root even in the soil of defeat. To carry that knowledge home was both blessing and burden. When the day finally came and the gates opened for departure, the women walked in silence, each step heavy with the weight of both hope and dread. The guards stood at attention, their faces unreadable, though their eyes betrayed a quiet respect. Some women turned their heads for one last look at the camp, as though it had become less a prison than a reluctant sanctuary. Others kept their gaze fixed forward, determined not to falter. The buses rumbled to life, their engines drowning out the murmurs of farewell. The fences, sharp and glittering in the morning sun, receded behind them. Yet as the women pressed their faces to the glass, they realized the true fences were not those of barbed wire or watchtowers. The true fences were the ones they carried within, woven from memory, fear, and longing, boundaries that no journey across an ocean could dissolve. For some, those fences would haunt them forever, reminders of captivity that lingered long after freedom. For others, they would become the framework upon which to rebuild, proof that even in the darkest of times, dignity and humanity could endure. The war had taken much, but it had not taken everything. And as the buses carried them away, the Japanese women understood that the hardest journey was not the return home, but the one that would unfold within their own hearts. The days in the camp bled into one another, yet each sunset carried its own weight. For the Japanese women, captivity had ceased to be a single moment of surrender, and become instead a long, unbroken mirror in which they saw themselves reflected in ways they could not have imagined. The enemy was no longer a faceless monster from propaganda posters, nor a looming threat whispered about in the ashes of Tokyo. He was a guard who whistled songs in the dusk, a soldier who carried trays of food with the same steady hands that once gripped rifles, a boy whose shadow stretched long against the barracks, but whose laughter sounded painfully ordinary. When the rumors came, rumors of ships, of repatriation, of return, the women found no joy in the thought of release. Home was gone, its streets flattened, its fields burned, its graves too many to count. To step back onto Japanese soil was to return, not to life, but to absence. And yet, to remain here, inside fences built for their confinement, felt strangely like the safer choice, for here at least there was food. Here there was warmth. Here there was a kind of dignity that their own nation had failed to preserve. And so they stood at the threshold, torn between the world they had lost and the world they had found. In the quiet moments before dawn, when frost glittered on the wire and the sky began to pale, they understood the irony that history had written for them, that their greatest lesson of humanity came not from victory nor from loyalty, but from the hands of the very men they had once been taught to hate.